Okay,
Okay,
all is well.
great. Welcome to the Genetic Genius, Dr. Anderson. I'm so excited to have you as my guest today. And before we dive deep in, I'd love for you to just introduce yourself, tell people about who you are, your passion, your place on the planet.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm Paul Anderson. I'm a naturopathic physician from Seattle, Washington. I grew up here in the Northwest, and I've been doing this a long time. I currently spend most of my time teaching doctors of all types, and also doing a lot of writing and patient education. So that's which is a plenty full-time job,
Yeah.
and so it's very rewarding though, because you spend a lot of time learning things the hard way or learning things over time, and then you interact with doctors who are a bit newer or a lot newer, and you realize, they don't have to learn all those things the hard way or the slow way or whatever way we did it. So
Right.
so it's been really good. And then, in the last 4 or 5 years, my writing was always to doctors, and then about 3, 4 years ago, I got into writing project for the public, and I'm
Mm-hmm.
doing more of that now. So the kind of branching out into educating the public about health and how to have maybe a better integrated look of your health, et cetera, that's my goal. So when I'm not chasing grandchildren, I'm doing all that stuff. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. I love it. Yeah, I'm super excited to talk about your books today and your knowledge. You have so much that you share with not only the community in Seattle, but with the world with your books. And I am so appreciative of that you share with everyone.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, so let's dive deep into the conversation. I'd love to talk about cancer because I think you just have so much knowledge about that. And, our listeners are really curious because if they haven't been directly affected, they probably have a loved one or know a friend or, people are always wondering, what is this thing people call cancer? So let's talk about that first. What is cancer anyway?
It's a great place to start. Yeah, I think that's kind of a very normal thing for us humans. Unless you have cancer yourself or someone really close to you, it's the kind of thing, it's like car accidents. We don't want to think about it, right? It's a bad
Mm-hmm.
thing that we don't want to think about. But people are becoming more and more educated now than I think that they used to, about things like that, and about wanting to know about prevention, but also, do we have options when we go to treat it? The bottom line with cancer is when a process within your body goes on its own time and its own metabolism and everything separate from you. So you
Mm.
have a lot of processes in your body that are coordinated within your body, or they're separate, like your microbiome, but they're symbiotic with you.
Mm-hmm.
Cancer is separate, but it's not symbiotic with you. It has its own goals in mind for metabolism and
Right.
maintaining its health and all, and they don't have you and your best interests at heart. And there's a lot of different triggers for cancers. There's a lot of different reasons that people will get cancer. Some we know, some we really don't understand very well. Um, and so the first thing I usually like to just put out, because you'll always, if you start too quickly down the road of prevention or treatment or
Mm-hmm.
whatever, you miss certain groups of folks. And one thing I think is important to say is it's you can always do everything perfectly and still get sick with something,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and whether that's a virus or cancer or whatever, we want to, honor the fact that there's always things that fall outside of stuff we're going to talk about. And
Right.
people just, little babies get cancer, and people who have never had, any toxic stuff or whatever, and they get cancer. And
Mm-hmm.
so they'll, and I say that because I deal with so many people who have cancer. It's, if you're that person who, really tried to have a great diet and lifestyle and all this stuff, and you still develop cancer,
Mm-hmm.
you can feel a little bit put upon by discussions about that. So on one hand, we want to, acknowledge that, but on the other hand, there are a lot of things that I think make the cancer rates we have now so much higher than what they used to be.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that you can look at those, of course, that's a negative, but you can then look and say, well, what do they have in common? And maybe we could all do things that would oppose cancer or at least slow it down or make us
Mm-hmm.
less likely a target. So, yeah, so cancer literally is a process in your body that hijacks your own cells and creates a metabolism, a demand for nutrients and everything separate from you, and it is about itself. And so
Mm-hmm.
the bigger that gets, the sicker you get as a person.
Yeah, that was a great description. I liked how you said one with hijacker. You know, I had this
Hmm.
image of just like the person getting on the plane and be like,
Yeah,
"I'm taking over."
it it literally is taking
Yeah,
over. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. And then it also reminded me of, you know, it's kind of like the ego. Like cancer has
Hmm.
this whole, you know, mind of its own, and it's now steering the ship. But as you were saying, there are lots of different ways that we can help in the process.
Exactly,
To
exactly. Yeah,
regain
100%.
control, I
Yeah,
guess.
that's very important. Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah, yeah.
Okay, great. And how does, from the naturopathic perspective, how does that differ from the conventional model when we're talking about looking at cancer? Is there a difference there?
Well, I think there's sort of two sides of the coin. One is from the point of view of the science of, let's say, tumor biology or development of cancer or recurrence of cancer, at least the way that I look at things and most of the naturopathic oncology people I know, it's not that there's a separation or a divide.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same science and everything. Sometimes in naturopathic or integrative oncology, we might have a little broader view of things. And
Mm.
so the science is the same, but we may look at it with a little broader lens. And partly that is not because, say, my friends who are medical oncologists in the standard system don't don't believe that this is the way to do it. It's just that their tools are very finite. They're very big, heavy tools, and they're very finite. So their look at tumor biology and all these things is focused through the lens of their tools. In integrative or naturopathic oncology, the tool set is much wider, and
Mm-hmm.
we're not narrowed down to, if you're a medical oncologist, you do chemotherapy. If you're a radiation oncologist, you do radiation therapy, and you have to be really good and specialized at that. So their lens is very narrow. Ours is much broader, and so we may see the science and say, well, this is actually the newer science, say about tumor recurrence and certain other things. It underscores what we've been talking about the whole time,
Mm-hmm.
and it makes us even more keen on saying, things like diet and lowering toxin levels and all these things are very important. So I don't really see it as different. I just see it as what's the view you're taking of it from,
Mm-hmm.
your point of view of your profession. So I try to be as broad-minded as possible, but also, you know, uh, one thing about tumor biology is it's new every week. It's like immunology. It's evolving and new, and they're trying to learn things. So
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of really good information that I think can be used through our lens to help more people.
Yeah, that's great. You know, and I think you nailed it on the head there. As saying it's like that integrative approach is so important and key because, you know, there's so much knowledge coming from both sides, and working together as a symbiotic relationship then allows the patient or person to have so much more of better care.
Yep, that's the whole
Hmm.
goal. Yeah,
Right. Yeah. The best care,
yeah,
but that's our goal, right?
that's right. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
So what are some of the root causes or triggers? How does the body first start to get out of this alignment? And I know, as you said earlier, that not everyone might, you know, anyone can develop some type of cancer. They might not be out of alignment, right? But what are
Sure,
some, yeah, what
sure.
are, let's talk about
Yeah,
more broad, I
but
guess.
yeah, I think if you, I mean, we, of course, in the beginning we said that you can do everything right and still
Right.
develop cancer, but if you look at the majority of
Hmm.
cancers where there's maybe a more clear pathway, I think then you can say there are some things in common. And in in the first book about cancer that Dr. Stengler and I wrote, that we'll talk about later, one of the sections I got to write were the theories around the cause of cancer.
Mm-hmm.
And so this has been a large, somewhat of a debate, but more of just scientific endeavor forever to try and sort out why, why does cancer develop? What are its drivers? And what comes out is there are really three ideas about cancer uh, as a tumorigenesis to the beginning of cancer.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and the way I look at them is not so much that they're competing ideas, but they're looking at the problem of cancer and they're seeing a piece of the problem from, again, a point of view.
Right, exactly.
And the three theories or the three ideas that we have currently in modern times, some date back a long time, are not exclusive of one another.
Mm-hmm.
So to make them the shortest version I can of these three is one is the genetic theory of cancer, and that is that bad genes beget bad cell processes, which
Right.
beget tumors,
Mm-hmm.
right? And there are certainly some cancers that are very hardwired into the genome.
Mm-hmm.
And you see that quite a bit with childhood pediatric cancers,
Right.
where that's actually probably the main cause. It's a child didn't have any influence other than these genes that went really badly. In adults, humans, young through old adults, what you see with the genetically predetermined cancers is even the ones with real high penetrance, there's still 40, 50, 60% of people with the same genes get cancer, and 40 plus or minus
Mm.
percent don't get cancer. So there's obviously other factors for the adult ones, and
Right,
those are
exactly.
epigenetic factors, et cetera. So the genetic ideas or theory is one area, and it certainly is real. It certainly exists.
Mm-hmm.
There's another big area which has made a huge research. It's 100-some-year-old idea about cancer, but it's made a resurgence in the last 10 years because of modern researchers and science, and that's the metabolic theory or metabolic ideas around cancer. And that is where our metabolism shifts in a direction that's just much more pro-cancer, very easy
Mm-hmm.
for tumorigenesis to occur. And again, that means then that there's forces that occur through metabolism as opposed to genetics that would maybe
Right.
trigger cancer growth. And again, those two are different, but they're not mutually exclusive. You can
Mm-hmm.
have
And they could work
parts of both.
together or
Yeah,
be happening at the same time.
exactly. And then the
Mm-hmm.
third one is a real interesting one because it sometimes like when you're writing, and whether it's doing a research paper or you're writing a book or whatever, you get really lucky and something gets published before your deadline, right?
Right. Zing.
So
Oh,
so
look.
when I was working on this third one to try and distill it down and explain it to people, um, I, I was hoping to find some newer research that would sort of tie together 100-plus-year-old ideas with modern ideas.
Yeah.
Because one of the things that happens with these older ideas is they go through a phase where they're the big idea, and then they're sort of, oh, no one likes them, and then they make a little
They
resurgence
lose
and no
their
one likes them,
fad.
up and down.
Right.
And part of what happens if it's more than 20, 30 years old, but especially when you get to 100 years old, if you're looking at science from 100 years ago, the language was quite different. What we knew
Mm-hmm.
was different. Our ideas about tumor biology were very different than they are now. So there's actually this super old theory called the trophoblastic theory.
Mm-hmm.
And in modern research, um, they actually brought that theory forward and said, we were maybe looking at this through not as informed eyes scientifically, et cetera, but this modern theory that we have called the cancer stem cell theory
Mm-hmm.
is actually the same as the trophoblastic theory if we just change some of the names and name
Yeah.
them what we would call them
Modern
now.
naming.
Yeah, so like modern understanding of how cells work and modern naming and all that. So
Mm-hmm.
that was really, it was exciting because we got newer science to sort of sew up those loose ends. But the other thing was a lot of times in science, what happens, and especially around cancer, you observe something, and the observation may be completely correct. You might have completely wrong ideas about what created the observation, or
Mm-hmm.
you might not have the tools to study what you're observing.
Right.
That's in a sense what the modern idea of the cancer stem cell theory from the old trophoblastic theory really was. It was observed correctly. We just didn't have the biology to figure it out. So the CSC, cancer stem cell theory, again, is not really a theory, it's a proven fact. But this is that there are cancer stem cells, just like people stem cells make us. So,
Mm-hmm.
one stem cell can turn into a whole bunch of things.
Right.
A cancer stem cell is autonomous from the cancer. It can either be very active or very quiet, depending on what's happening. And you can have these that are not doing anything. But
Mm-hmm.
if you do the wrong things to them, from the point of view of the human,
Right.
the right things from the point of view of the tumor cell, the cancer stem cells will develop and
Mhm.
give out daughter cells that create cancer.
Right.
And so the cancer stem cell idea is it bridges a lot of territory too.
Mhm.
And so when I speak to either like medical students or the public or whatever, because everyone's kind of got the same questions, the first thing I'll do is describe these, and then the next thing I'll do is say, because they all appear to be true and there are little different points of view of cancer, what would be in common with them?
Right.
Well, one thing that's in common with all three of them is the epigenetic triggers
Mhm.
that would turn on a cancer stem cell, or that would turn on a genome, hardwired problem that would develop cancer, or even that would, metabolomics are epigenetics,
Right.
from the metabolism point of view. So the theme they have, all through them, is epigenetics. And then that leads to, well, if that's the theme with all of these, although they have little specific things that might be
Mhm.
different, what would strategies from that theme be then to help people prevent or treat or recover from cancer? So I think that's a really nice way to look at it, is what are the causes we know about? What do they all have in common? And what does that commonality give me as far as treatment, prevention, strategies to help?
Yeah, that's a great explanation, and gives our listeners also this all-encompassing view of it from, like you said, from that different lens. And I liked how you brought the epigenetics, like, back into the foreground. And so from that perspective, epigenetic testing or genetic testing there's a lot of different things out there. Is there specific markers that, or like a specific DNA test that you recommend that from a preventative aspect? But if we're, I know that doesn't always, as you said, it's like 40 to 60%.
Yeah, I think, and I think, which is still a pretty significant
Mhm.
percent. I think the first thing is that, for people who maybe don't look into all of these words,
Right.
so,
There's a lot of
you know,
complicated
e-
words.
epigenetics is anything that can affect your genome to function better or worse. And
Hmm.
that includes everything in your life, right?
Right.
So, it's
Yeah.
diet, metabolism, the air you breathe, the fluids you
Lifestyle,
take in,
exercise.
yeah, how you think, all of it's wrapped up in there. So so from the point of view of any of those three,
Hmm.
if you look at whether it's, say, a gene that gets turned on that creates cancer, or a tumor stem cell gets turned on,
Hmm.
the mechanics are almost identical.
Right.
Now,
Just like turning a switch.
this, it's two different switches, but the switches
Hmm.
turn the same way.
Yeah.
With metabolism, it's a little bit more linear, but it's all about epigenetics there. So I think that the first thing that I usually talk to people about, and it's not that, like, I've done a lot of, genomic testing and training, and
Hmm.
helping people with that, but usually before that, it's like, well,
Right.
what are the things that are sort of universally good for your epigenome? So that would be things like, taking in the cleanest food and fluids that you can
Hmm.
take in, We can't get away from toxins, but living as
Right.
low a toxin
Unless you live
life
in a
as you
bubble.
can. Yeah, it's like
Not gonna happen.
in modern times, there's no place on the planet you can go and get away. So, but you can
Right.
do, you don't have to also try and be toxic, right? You can do as
Right.
little as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Um, movement, exercise, all of those good
Mm-hmm.
things, the way that we think, the mind-body connection and our psychoneuroimmunology, all of those things are very, very important.
Mm-hmm.
And they're kind of, uh, they are indifferent to your genes, really, except that they're helpful to them.
Right.
Now, when I was working one-on-one with patients, what I would do then is after that, especially if they were in like a prevention or a secondary prevention mode, we'll talk about those in a minute, but
Mm-hmm.
preventive modes, we would then often look at their genomics and say, in addition to, doing all these good things, diet and lifestyle,
Mm-hmm.
you have some areas that are likely going to just slow down in either your detoxification enzymes or maybe some of your neurotransmitter
Mm-hmm.
enzymes and processes, or potentially the way you use vitamin D or whatever it is.
Right.
You got a
The whole
million things
gamut.
you can say. So for tuning things up for you, you just need a little extra attention there. So yes, you have to do all the diet lifestyle things
Mm-hmm.
to keep things clean and working. But then for you, particular patient, you need maybe more support around the area of phase 2 detoxification and
Right.
glutathione and all those goodies.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe you're not a great vitamin D handler, so
Mm-hmm.
you'd be really good to do this with your vitamin D. So it's sort of those two layers. One is the global things we all probably can do and need
The
to do.
foundations.
Yeah, and then the
Mm-hmm.
rest is fine tuning, really. And I find that and I'll explain what I mean in just a second, but when you're in either of the types of prevention with cancer, that's the time where you have the headspace and the time in your, what you're doing to treat yourself, to deal with, these things on a bigger scale.
Mm-hmm.
And so a kind of a mental image I try and work with people is, cancer really has 4 phases that it
Mm-hmm.
occurs in. And you have to allocate resources depending on what phase you're in, right? So
Exactly.
if if your house is on fire, you have to leave your house first and and then
Right.
put the fire out, right?
Yeah.
If your house is not on fire, you can buy a fire extinguisher and and
Put the
and
fire out.
don't play with matches and stuff like that. So it's sort of, you have to be pragmatic and look at, okay, where are you in the process? So the 4
Mhm.
parts, the first one is what we call primary prevention, which thankfully a lot more people want to do that now. And that means I
Right.
don't have cancer, or I don't know that I have cancer, because a lot of us have cancer cells that come and go.
Right.
But I don't want to get it. I want to prevent it in the primary setting. We get a lot of people who have friends and family, who've had a particular cancer. They watch them go through it, and they come in and say, I don't think I have cancer, but I just want to, how do I live in a way that I avoid that if at all
Mhm.
possible?
Most
So that's,
optimal health.
yeah, optimal health. That's primary
Mhm.
prevention. The next phase is really when you know you have cancer, and it's your diagnosis through your active treatment. Now, active treatment is all over the map. It can be a whole bunch of, medical and surgical and radiation things and natural things. It can be just one of them. It can just be natural. It depends really on a million variables.
Right.
But that's sort of like your house just caught on fire, and your goals are about the fire, right?
Mhm.
In this case, about cancer. So with someone who's just diagnosed and going into treatment, your focus, you might have like these big global goals of improving diet and lifestyle and doing all this stuff, which you'll work on, but your real focus is dealing with and living through and optimizing the treatment, phase that you're in. So in those cases, a lot of times we're just, we pick very big, high payout sort of things, like
Right. The most bang
drink
for the
enough
buck.
water, have your diet foster a metabolism that's, pro
Mhm.
muscle and all this stuff. Um, and then you get to the third phase, though. So you've got primary prevention and then active treatment and diagnosis. The third phase is actually super important, especially for preventing long-term, and that's recovery from treatment. So as integrative naturopathic oncology people, we deal with a lot of people who come right after they're done with treatment. They say, I'm either I still have cancer, or I'm in remission, or no evidence of disease, etc. And I'm done with my you fill in the blank treatment,
Right.
chemo, radiation, surgery, whatever. And they told me to, go and, heal up, rest up, and then check in every 3 months or every 6 months or whatever. Well, that's a phase where you critically can intervene as a physician and as a patient, and do things where the standard system is really leaving it to your body to heal up.
Right.
So we get a lot of people where that's when they encounter us, is in this third phase, and it's about recovery. Now, what people, if you read our book, we talk about it, but what people will miss is the time. Certainly during treatment this happens, but when you're done with treatment through recovering, the better you do that, the less likely you are to have the treatment create more cancer.
Right,
So
exactly.
something that we put in the book, and we're the first book to publish it. It's in research papers before, but we're the first book to publish it, and now it's become people are talking about it a lot. It is very well known that chemotherapy and radiation trigger later cancers.
Yeah.
And this is very hardcore tumor biology publications. That's the bad news. The good news is they don't have to.
Right.
So if you think about this discussion we had about epigenetic triggers, if you take radiation or chemotherapy, for the most part, they are a big epigenetic trigger in the direction of turning on the bad genes. That's why they trigger later cancers. Why do they shrink tumors initially? It's because they are toxic to the tumor. So that's the
Right.
upside of them. So if you think about it, then what would the goal be when you're done with treatment? It's to clean the body up and help it detox from all the therapies, so that the therapies don't become one more epigenetic trigger.
Right.
So and there's obvious things in recovery, like maybe you're real fatigued, or you're recovering from surgery and you need to heal. Those are obvious
Yeah.
focuses for the recovery phase. But the other thing is, just now we've got this time, we're not doing active cancer treatment. We can look at things like how toxic are you, or what, really get into the specifics of your diet or whatever it is. And so those are the big three. And then the fourth one, which is the one everyone wants to get to, which nowadays we have more people now here and wanting to stay there. That's called secondary prevention. That means you had cancer, it's gone, or it's level and not going anywhere, and you want to prevent new cancers or recurrence. Super
Right.
important.
Yeah.
Obviously,
Super
that's what
important.
everybody
Yeah.
wants. Yeah.
Right.
Well, and what's interesting is secondary and primary prevention have the same goals. It's just secondary prevention, you had cancer. Primary
Right.
prevention, you didn't. Um, in secondary prevention, you're generally healed up from your therapies and all that. And that's when we take a big macro look at, certainly the specifics of diet and lifestyle, but also that's a time when people's hormone systems are really messed up.
Right.
And that's not
Exactly.
a good epigenetic thing, to have your hormones all messed up.
No.
That's a time usually people can kind of get around to specifically checking for toxins, and maybe some of the genomic detox pathways that aren't
Right.
working. Let's find out about that. That's a time to, I'll tell you something, I always thought this was true. How it is, you think things are true and you
Right.
check them out.
You're like,
But
is
when
that
we,
really true?
yeah, it's like, it looks like it's true. But when we started to get more secondary prevention people, it became, about 10 years ago, we started to actually see people would come in, and a lot of times they, let's say stage 2 breast or prostate cancer, one of the common ones, and they're like, I'm in remission. The oncologist said stay in remission. They didn't tell me how to stay in remission. They just said stay
Right.
in
I just said,
remission.
here's your prescription, stay in
So
remission.
can you help me with that? I said, yeah. So that's secondary prevention. So at that point, we would look at hormonal stuff, look at detox and all that. But the thing that I always thought that would be true, but I didn't know till I saw a bunch of these people and we tested them, was after chemo and radiation, the immune system takes a hit. So a
Mm-hmm.
lot of those folks would be carrying around asymptomatic chronic infections that were stealthy. They didn't feel great, but they didn't feel
Right.
sick with them. And
Mm-hmm.
if we wouldn't have checked for them, no one would have done anything.
Yeah.
And one of the problems is a lot of these things hang out in your lymphatic system, these chronic
Mm-hmm.
infections. And if you've had cancer, your lymphatics don't need more stress. None
Right.
of your body does, but
Right.
certainly
But
your
especially
lymphatics.
lymphatics.
So our goal then, in addition to diet and lifestyle, would be let's get the hormones rebalanced. Let's work on the specific genomic things that we
Mm-hmm.
find. Let's get things like chronic infections and other stuff to just clear the, it's kind of like let's clean the garage out for once and
Right.
all and get it all
Clean slate.
organized, and and then work on what can we do to just keep you getting healthier and healthier. And that
Mm-hmm.
actually, it became very rewarding to see that we got finally those patients where we could do that. But you kind of see with the arc of things, primary prevention, yes, you're doing what you do in secondary, but the stakes are lower because you haven't had
Right.
cancer.
Yeah.
You also haven't had chemotherapy or radiation or something.
Right.
So it's a little easier to do.
Mm-hmm.
You, stage 2, when you first get diagnosed and you're being treated, most of your efforts go into that and living through that. Recovery, all your efforts go into recovery and cleaning your
Mm-hmm.
system up. So secondary prevention really is a time where all these cool things can be done to a deeper degree. And I think that so all of these, like dividing things, all this stuff, they're always sort of things that I kind of felt my way through clinically. But as we were preparing the material to write the book and looking at patient cases, and I was involved in some cancer research right before the book was
Mm-hmm.
being written, it was taking a look backwards at those couple of decades and then saying, what are the commonalities of people when they come in, like these different stages?
Right. The themes.
What are the themes that more successful people have who had a better chance of getting in remission, let's say? What were the
Mm-hmm.
themes of the people that just really tanked quickly or didn't heal
Yeah.
well? So all this stuff we're talking about is just a little more cleaned up version of what was sort of swimming around,
Right.
clinically for a while.
Yeah, and I think that's so key for people to understand because there's a lot of different stages to the not just the evolution but the prevention,
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
you explained that so beautifully. And there was a lot of different things that you mentioned there. So let's go back and kind of hit some of those key
Yes.
highlights in a little bit more detail. Let's talk about the food and nutrition aspect. You mentioned it a little bit, and that's like one of my super favorite topics. So I wanted to kind of ask a little bit about, let's just, what are there specific foods you mentioned a little bit about that, but about that can, one, increase the risk of developing cancer, or two, ones that can be helpful for prevention. So we can answer those one at a time, of course.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And again, kind of like the genomic question, it's the same
Mm-hmm.
kind of stratification. So the first thing I always tell people is you want to start with the basics because the basics affect every little nook and cranny of your
Yeah.
metabolism or your diet or whatever. So that is eating as clean as you can, the
Mm-hmm.
fluids that we take in being as clean as they can.
Water.
Uh, yes, as much water with as few chemicals as possible,
Right.
all of that. So that's sort of the macro. The
Mm-hmm.
next thing though is actually pretty macro too, and most patients actually can hook into this. Um, when you are thinking of either fueling your body with
Mm-hmm.
food or moving your body from the fuel, so either
Mm-hmm.
side of the equation, um, cancer has really just two processes that go on within us that it either likes or doesn't like. So obviously with cancer, since we want to talk about us as people and not the cancer, whatever cancer doesn't like would be what we want to promote, right?
Right.
So it's not as well fed by toxic things and all that. That's why we're so big
Mm-hmm.
there. But the other thing is, in your metabolism in your body, if you think of the two major metabolizing sections, muscle and fat metabolism, they're very
Right.
different in the way they operate. more muscle metabolism equals longer life with cancer, better survival, all that stuff. More
Mm-hmm.
fat metabolism equals shorter life, more rapid development of cancer. So if you look backwards and you say, okay, and this goes a lot back to the metabolic ideas around cancer we
Right.
talked about, but they're also epigenetic. Um, these two things then, so the more I can make either to feed it or to use it, the muscle side work,
Mm-hmm.
the less I make the fat side work, the more anti-cancer I am. And that's really
Right.
important.
Yeah.
And so on the feeding side, really what it comes down to is you don't want to feed your body in a way that stimulates fat metabolism. And
Right.
so fat metabolism is connected to insulin
Mm-hmm.
metabolism,
Mm-hmm.
right? So what I always tell people is it's not about the people have this amorphous idea of fat and whatever, but
Right.
um, the more you stimulate insulin in your body that is not
Mm-hmm.
really needed, the more inflamed you get, and
Right.
then the muscle or the fat turns on receptors to grow bigger and be more inflamed. All that.
Right.
That's
Takes
very
over.
pro-cancer. Yeah.
Yeah, not
So
good.
so what you want to do is eat in a way where your insulin is just what you need. It's not
Mm-hmm.
extra.
Not excess. Mm-hmm.
So things like I'll tell people, to start with the plant kingdom. Um, most plants are set up in a way when animals and humans eat them, they have a mixture of things in them. So there's
Mm-hmm. The rainbow.
flavonoids and all the color and
Mm-hmm.
minerals and vitamins and stuff. And then there's going to be some plant fats and some little bit of aminos and
Mm-hmm.
some carbs. But your body's going to use all that stuff very synergistically.
Right.
So if your diet kind of focuses on that as its hub, and then you have appropriate amounts of, say, fat and and proteins and then whatever else is going to be in there. You're feeding your system in a way that's very pro muscle side of metabolism
Mm-hmm.
because you're not
Yeah.
stimulating a bunch of insulin.
Right.
The opposite would be if you sit down and you eat, just take a I was going to say a silly example, but this is not, people do this. So well, let's say,
Right.
instead of a bunch of vegetables and then some protein and stuff, you sit down and you eat a giant bowl of ice cream, right? Uh,
What? You can't do
well,
that?
well, you can
You
certainly,
can, right? Yes, you can.
but here's what's going to happen. Instead of this nice balanced thing where there's all these dense nutrients and not a lot of insulin signature and all that,
Mm-hmm.
you eat the ice cream, which is I love. It's wonderful. But what happens then is your insulin is triggered in a way because there's going to be a lot of sugar, some fat, and other stuff. But it's basically just those things. There's not a lot of the other
Mm-hmm.
nutrients, etc. Your insulin has to go way high to deal with that suddenly.
Yeah.
And in most people, what happens is it overshoots a bit because it the job of insulin is to take the
Mm-hmm.
energy from the sugar, put it into your cells. So that's a
Use
good
it.
thing. But we don't want a lot of extra insulin running. Well, that's what
Right.
happens. Extra insulin is sort of like a little kid who's not being watched. Like it'll get into stuff, right?
Right.
So
Yeah.
extra, and this is a very cartoonish version of the metabolic theories, but extra insulin, when you have it, goes around and actually turns on inflammatory triggers. So
Mm,
rather than opening up the glucose receptors like it's supposed to,
right.
it goes and it literally turns on things such as the good fats can be turned into inflammatory fats in our body.
Mm-hmm.
That's not good for us.
No, not good.
A lot of other, vessel inflammation and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think about that, and then you've got maybe some cancer brewing, like that inflammatory signature just turns those guys on too, right? So
Mm-hmm.
so dietarily, so I try and get people to be as like
More
pragmatic as
broad.
possible. So like clear, clean foods, and then
Mm-hmm.
like look at your macros and balance and get a lot of plant material. And then after that, what we would always tell patients is there's two things about specific diets. There's a lot more, but there's two basic things about
Two main ones.
specific cancer diets.
Mm-hmm.
And the first one is you should hydrate.
Drink more water.
Always hydrate, but no. The first one is what is do you have a tumor type or an advanced disease or whatever where
Mm-hmm.
we may want to be real aggressive with a diet change? Okay,
Right.
so
A big
then,
shift.
you know,
Mm-hmm.
you come in with a advanced pancreatic cancer that has a very low chance of being treated by standard means. You want to do everything you can. We're going to be
Mm-hmm.
very aggressive on the diet side because you don't have a lot of time, right?
Right.
So there's that. There's what's appropriate for that type of cancer and how aggressive we need to be. The
Mm-hmm.
other one, which is equally important, is if I describe this intervention to you, will you and can you do it? Right?
Right. Are you going to
You know,
comply to
because there
it?
are people who you can kind of send them in one of two directions dietarily that are pretty aggressive, but they will only gravitate towards actually doing one and not the other, right?
Right.
So let's take the most extreme versions of we don't have time, we have to get your metabolism working the right way,
Mm-hmm.
and and your diet's going to be a huge tool here, and you say as a patient, yeah, let's,
Let's do
I'll
it.
do it,
All
let's go,
in.
yeah, because I know I don't have options here, I don't have a lot of time. The two ends of the diet spectrum, and there's a lot of shades of gray in between that are very specific, so I'm simplifying, but the two polar opposites that actually do almost the same thing, interestingly, one is a very strict, aggressive ketogenic type diet,
Mm-hmm.
which actually there are different ways to do it, but basically it pushes more fat into your system, very, very low amount of carbohydrate, no
Mm-hmm.
sugars, and moderate, not a lot of protein. And if you do too much protein on a keto diet, it ruins it. So
Right.
actually a fairly low amount of protein. That pushes your body metabolically into a pattern that's fairly anti-cancer on its own. So
Mm-hmm.
some people, we describe that works. We have a lot of people that will say that sounds really good, but I could never do that, or I
Right.
did and I got sick or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
The other end of the spectrum that will say as well, if that one doesn't work for you, then the other option we have to, again, just kind of get a hold of your metabolism and say, we're changing things now. We're going to
Mm-hmm.
be very anti-cancer. We would actually put the patients on an induction diet of a raw food
Mm-hmm.
vegetarian diet,
Mm-hmm.
and then they would move into what we call a modified Mediterranean diet.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that one for people who just couldn't see themselves eating keto, that one was more doable. But the modifications, so a med diet, the things that we took out of Mediterranean diet in an advanced cancer were the grain products.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Inflammatory grains. Mm-hmm.
Sometimes definitely the grain products. Anything else that would be on the more inflammatory, insulin stimulating end,
Mm-hmm.
and then focus on the vegetables and the clean proteins and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting is I've seen really miraculous things with both of them when people were very clear about like doing, one under the other.
Mm-hmm.
And I really think that the thing that, because they're very different diets if you look at
Yeah.
them just from the top down, the thing that ties them together is there's not a lot of junk. Junk calories are almost zero or minimized.
Right.
There's no, junk sugars,
Processed
toxic
foods are
things, all
out.
that stuff is out.
Mm-hmm.
But also at the end of the day, albeit keto goes the whole one way and modified Mediterranean another way, you're still not triggering a lot of insulin
Mm.
stimulation on either one of them. So the
Right.
inflammatory part is down too. And so, and there's things you do to support both of them. But on the diet side of things, those are sort of, I like those as bookends for people to visualize. So then
Yeah.
let's say someone says, well, I survived, stage 1 or 2 prostate cancer, breast cancer, and I could live another 40 years. How should I eat?
Right.
Then you can say, okay, you can kind of do versions of either end of the spectrum that have a little more variety.
Mm-hmm.
What appeals to you as far as the way that you and your family eat, and then we kind
Long
of
term. Mm-hmm.
specifically, send them either direction.
Mm-hmm.
So with diet, it's there's a lot of options. Um, there's almost never a time where you can only do one kind of thing, but you have to keep the basics in mind. We don't want to be
Right.
pro-inflammatory. We don't want to put, we don't want to retoxify our body every time we
No,
eat,
not a good
right?
idea. Right.
Those are the non-negotiables, and everything else is something you can work out.
Right, and in
Yeah.
between. Yeah. Yeah. I think you really spoke about, that key to having the person want to do it. And, if they
Yeah.
really want to
Yeah.
do it, then both of those diets or lifestyle changes will work because they're
Hmm.
like, I'm all in, I
Yeah.
got this.
Yeah. And most people, it's not for lack of wanting to do something, but
Mm-hmm.
and we've had a lot of people where they were fine either, they just say, just tell me what to do, I'll do it.
Right.
But there are people where just either culturally or
Mm-hmm. Or
they maybe
stress.
don't
Mm-hmm.
have control over all of the food, and
Mm-hmm.
or it just seems too daunting to do one or the
Right.
other. It's nice that they have an option that also supports their body dietarily, and
Mm-hmm.
and they can choose a little bit, because yeah, you can have the greatest treatment in the world, but if you can't do it, it's not going to help you,
Right.
right?
Yeah. Like if you go to
Right.
what's that, the center in Santa Rosa, is it the Optimal Health Institute? It's
I
the
Yeah,
fasting clinic,
I
something
think
like
that's
that.
it. Yeah.
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 Anyway, like going there for a week, but if you're not having a good time or you're not going to have those
Right.
lifestyles stick, it's not going to, right. Why did I go anyway?
Yeah, it's just not going to help you if you
Not going to
don't do
help.
it. So yeah.
Okay, great. Good. And, what about, are there specific foods that can increase like the repair of the DNA and the oxidative damage that has occurred from the cancer, or preventing cancer moving forward?
Hmm.
Would that be the same
Yeah,
kind of
really.
aspect
Y-
you were talking about before?
Yeah, so we brought it up a little bit in the an earlier thing we were talking about. I forget which one, but more specifically, then, when you get beyond the big triggers, like say the insulin triggering inflammatory stuff, if
Mm-hmm.
you look at the research around food material and turning off cancer signals, right?
Right.
Then you're looking at they have a global category they call dietary polyphenols, and that includes the colorful parts of the plant world, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the flavonoids and like people hear about bioflavonoids, a kind
Right.
of a polyphenol, etc. And if you look at the things you would eat, bulkier things, like not just spices and things, but foods, you a lot of darker, denser foods. So
Mm-hmm.
most people have heard about like broccoli being a superfood or what. Well, that's because it has a lot of these polyphenols in it,
Mm-hmm.
and they actually are anti-cancer. Many of the other dark, heavy greens are that way as well.
Mm-hmm.
Darker red and blue things tend to
Mm-hmm.
have a lot of these in them, and many other things as well. But dietary polyphenols, as far as what you're eating, if you can get most, like a good chunk of every meal with those things in it,
Mm-hmm.
you have you actually have lower triggering of cancer that way too. So thinking about those things, so that's why I always tell people, look for color, look for depth of just the creation of the plant and all that.
Right.
Probably it's going to be one of these that has a lot of stuff in it.
Yeah.
So those things are very important on that end. The other thing, though, which is really interesting and important, is the things that you use to enhance your eating, like
Mm-hmm.
spices and herbs and
Right.
things.
Yeah.
So we hear
Make it
a
taste
lot
good.
about, yeah, turmeric
Mm-hmm.
certainly is a big famous one, and that's very true. But so are other things that we use a lot of. Now, in your regular the eating part of your diet, let's say, mushrooms are actually incredibly full of these good compounds and
Yeah.
a lot of other polysaccharides. And a lot of people, I think, I guess maybe because it sounded too simple to be true, but it used to be, especially for us North Americans, where the eating of mushrooms is
A foreign world.
was not always a big deal, right? So
Yeah.
then the first mushrooms that North Americans mostly saw were like button mushrooms.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Uh, and so what happened was, over the years, people assumed that button mushrooms were kind of like the iceberg lettuce of the mushroom world and
Right.
wouldn't help you, but it turns
Mm-hmm.
out they're actually quite anti-cancer, they're pro-immune, all this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so if that's the kind of mushrooms people eat, they need to know those are actually very useful and good for you.
Yeah.
But certainly all the other interesting mushrooms that have funny shapes and more, whether it's like the shiitakes or morels or other stuff, those all mushrooms are full of really good stuff for you. So it's another
Yeah.
good food. You can get a lot of nutrients, etc.
Mm-hmm.
But what we also like in my family, instead of certain other flavoring type things, we will actually make an extract using a mushroom as the
Mm-hmm.
base.
Mm-hmm.
And
Like a
there's a
mushroom
lot of,
broth or something,
yeah,
is that what
like
you mean?
and
Mm-hmm.
turn it into uh, like a vinegar based sauce or something. You
Oh
can do
yeah.
other stuff with it
Mm-hmm.
too.
Yum.
And so rather than using, like soy sauce or like other stuff, it's got a lot
Mm-hmm.
of flavor it adds, but it's also like taking a mushroom supplement with your
Mm-hmm.
food. So there's a
Right.
lot of ways you can get good stuff. Like
Mm-hmm.
colorful herbs are almost all have these polyphenols, and if you're adding them for flavor, that's great. Interesting. I did my podcast on this a couple months ago about immune foods.
Mm-hmm.
Did a few of those, but one of the things that I saw as I was looking at just traditional spices,
Right.
uh, because I thought, tends to be like the more ancient, civilizations stuff grows up not just because we like the taste, but it probably helped us stay
Right.
healthy
And
too.
stay alive.
You know, so and that which is true. A lot of we didn't get a lot of infections because of the spices used and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look at like very appearing, seemingly different spice blends from different parts of the world, whether it's like garam masala
Mm-hmm.
or South American chili spices or curries, or there's a million curries, but curries and all these other mixtures, they
Yeah.
all actually have a similar parent group of compounds in them. And
Mm-hmm.
it's usually 4 to 6 spices put together that they would put in almost every dish. But those things had antimicrobial and pro-immune and, you know, anti-cancer properties long before they knew that they were that good for them,
Right.
right?
Before they even knew the word
So
cancer.
yeah, so another thing I think is reacquainting, especially us North Americans, we're unless we have a family tradition of something that connects us to it, culinarily we're fairly divorced
Mm-hmm.
from whoever our ancestors were and how they ate and all that stuff. We can have this new world sort of eating. The only problem with that is a lot of new world eating doesn't include a lot of these spices or these other
Right.
things,
Mm-hmm.
and we have to like reintroduce them into our world,
Right.
so that
Experiment.
we use them. and
Yeah.
and the good side about that is you can pick whichever ones you like and they're all going to be just good. But the
Mm-hmm.
other thing is you look at most you say the standard American diet, so to speak,
Right.
it doesn't include these things. Like the main spices are black pepper, which is okay, and salt
Mm-hmm.
and sugar. Like that's that's what's going into most people's food.
Right.
That's not really the gateway to a whole lot of immune support, right?
No, not really. Yeah.
So branching out just with stuff you can find, and you can try little bits. And if you really like garam masala, that's great. You can use
Mm-hmm.
that. If you like curries, find one you like, or whatever.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of ways to incorporate healthy stuff into your lifestyle and your diet that's not um, onerous, and it doesn't make you feel like you're missing out. Like you
Mm,
can really have wonderful tasting food that's very good for you, and you're not missing anything.
right.
So I think
Yeah.
that's a real important thing for people, kind of to empower them.
Yeah, it sounds like having a great phytonutrient rich palette or plate
Yeah.
and then experimenting with different spices because we have so many I love cooking and there's so many different spices that are out there and I'm always like, oh, which one can I try tonight?
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
it's like I don't have enough room in my cabinet. And then I also like to use botanicals, different herbs in my cooking too. So that's always been an experiment as
Oh
well.
yeah. Yeah.
They're making, I don't know, Tulsi lemonade or something like that to really, add in a little different flavor, but still have a different constituent coming in, which is great.
Yeah.
I
Very
know that
true.
we could talk forever, but I want to be aware of your time and I want to make sure we get to talk about your wonderful book coming out, but also the other books that you have written, which I think you have behind you on your shelf. So let's
Yes.
talk about the book that you've written in the past first, and then we'll talk about your new book. So could you pull you have both of them behind you, I think, right?
I'll grab the cancer one.
Okay.
And
Maybe this is your new one. Okay.
the new one's not I don't have a physical
Oh, you
one
don't have
yet.
a copy
So
yet.
yeah, so that I'll talk about, and you can.
Okay, great.
So this, if you're listening, I'll read it. But so this is the first outside the box cancer therapies. Dr. Mark Stengler and myself wrote it together, and Mark is a doctor in Southern California, and this book has now been out 2 years, and
And it's a great book.
thank you. We tried it. It's I think now in 5 or 6 languages around the world.
Wow,
It's
that's
become
great.
fairly popular.
Yeah.
The reason we wrote this, though, when Mark and I sat down, he was the one that brought the idea to me, because I had always only written for doctors, and he had always only written for patients. And he came and he said, you've because he went to a conference I was teaching at. I was talking about the cancer research that we were doing at the time and what we had learned and all this stuff. And he says, you have a story to tell about this stuff. And he says, and I have a lot of things I've learned. And he says, I think if we pooled our resources, we could write a really good book for patients. So
Yeah.
we decided definitely to write it to patients. A lot of doctors use the book because it's well put together for the most part. The other thing, though, that we did, because the biggest complaint patients would give when they would go see their oncologist was, oncologists would be never have heard of some idea before and
Right.
say, I don't know if there's any research or whatever.
Exactly. What is
So
that?
we decided to research and reference the book like a textbook. So it's readable by anybody, but in the back there's almost 1,100 references for
Wow,
what
that's
we have.
amazing.
And so a lot of people then just share that with the oncologist. So then the oncologist can look and say, gee, I didn't know there was all these research on, this herb and cancer or this therapy. So it's written that way. It's very, like I said, there's a section on these, how do we get cancer? How do we approach, prevention? How do you specifically, the meat of the book really is, Mark and I's experience, which was over a very long period of time, and just reflecting that back for patients and saying, if you're going to spend your time and resources doing something, start here. And
Yeah.
if and if you have, say, colorectal cancer, these are the areas we would put our efforts in first, and then get
Right.
creative. If you have breast cancer, consider these things. And so it's really there to not just be a one size fits all, or here's a million things to do, but it's really to help you prioritize treatments and what you can do yourself, as a patient, to focus. So that's really the goal of the outside the box. You can get it anywhere that they sell books. So everyone's pretty much buying things online right now.
Right. Anywhere you can buy a book online.
So
Yeah.
anywhere
Or
online.
digital version too.
Yeah,
I have the digital version.
there is a Kindle version, and there's a paperback and a hardback, and you can get all of them.
I have a
But
book
just,
fetish, so I have to cut myself off.
yeah, I do too. So I have to be careful.
Yeah, I bought like 6 new books last week, so I was like, okay, that's enough.
Yeah. Otherwise, your walls come in at you, and
Right, totally.
yeah. Yeah. So it's easy to get, if you look. So there's a lot of books called Outside the Box, but not Outside the Box Cancer Therapies.
Okay, so be clear
And
about that.
look at
Okay.
either Stengler or Anderson as the road. And if you're not watching on a video, it's got this square orange in the center of it, which is a graphic designer's dream, apparently. So that's that book. And in the interim, when really before that book came out, I was as I said earlier, this whole thing of finding these like 4 places work in cancer and all this other stuff was really from reflection, looking back
Mm-hmm.
and trying to improve my patient and clinic encounters and things. The other thing I started to see was something we wrote a little bit about in the book, but is a whole book on its own, hence the new book, um,
Mm-hmm.
is the internal process you go through, whether it's you or your partner, your spouse or child or whatever, whoever has cancer and those that are close to them, the internal process you go through just from the diagnosis and how that hits your head and your heart and
Mm,
everything, that can either make you more likely to survive and healthy or less likely to.
mm-hmm.
And something that as I was reflecting on this and doing a lot of speaking about cancer and then working with patients and looking at their outcomes, something that I really saw that was a need was to give people a very clear pathway and really like a handbook to work through this process.
Right.
Because being diagnosed with cancer, like we talked about at the top of the show, is no one
Mm-hmm.
wants that diagnosis, right?
Right.
And nobody is looking for it. So when it happens, it's a surprise, even if you thought you were going to get cancer.
Right.
So that can either take you into a real dark negative place that's not about healing, or you can work through that. It takes everybody to a scary place, but you
Yeah.
can work through that to a place where you're empowered. And
Mm.
so the book is it'll be out in October, I am told.
Yay.
We're
That's great.
heavily in the middle of the publishing part.
Right. Mm.
And so the book, the title is simply Cancer, and then the subtitle is The Journey from Diagnosis to Empowerment.
Mm.
So this one is not, it's literally, it doesn't care what kind of therapies you're going to do. It's all about how do you take you from, oh no, I have cancer and I'm don't want to, or I'm angry about it or whatever,
Mm.
to a place where you are in charge of you and your diagnosis, and then you can do whatever it is that you do in a, from an empowered place. And it the book had a lot of, I did a lot of rewrites and a lot of stuff. I wrote it 3 times to kind of get it to where I felt it was, easy to follow. And then the editors
Mm-hmm.
help you
Right.
take it out of, doctor speak and all that.
Exactly.
Um, but the way that we wound up with it is it just talks through these things from the point of view of I've watched this with my patients for all these years.
Mm.
I've seen them take either better or worse turns with these things, and here's some ideas of, if you find yourself going down this road, here's how to, you know, to turn that to the, to the positive. So the second one, the cancer journey from diagnosis to empowerment, it's all about that, and it's written. Doesn't matter whether you're into integrative stuff or not, or whether you're just going to do all standard or all
For
natural or whatever.
everybody.
It's you and your family,
Mm.
to help out with that.
Yeah, that sounds wonderful. I'm looking forward to reading it. And it's a key aspect for cancer treatment is have that emotional component, which
Yeah,
doesn't always get addressed with patients, or family members, because
yeah,
it's just everything is going on so rapidly sometimes that kind of gets, in the closet, like, okay, we'll deal with that emotion later. So
yeah.
yeah.
Very, very much so. Yes.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So that
Yeah.
sounds great. And what are some of ways that people can follow you and find out more about what you do? You have a podcast as well, too.
Yeah. I think in modern times, probably the easiest thing is on Instagram.
Mm-hmm.
It's just DRA Online.
Dun, da,
Dr. A Online,
da.
just
That's
DRA
easy.
Online.
Yep.
And on Facebook, it's DR period A Online. I don't know how that worked out, but anyway, DRA Online. I think you'll find me at either place. The podcast is on any of the pod burners,
Mm-hmm.
so iHeartRadio or Google or iTunes, and it's called Medicine and Health with Dr. Paul Anderson.
Great.
So you have to have my name in there, but Medicine and Health, and Dr. Paul is usually how it comes up. And that's, gosh, I've been doing that for 6 years. So there's like 1,000,000 episodes of that.
Great, good. Well, I'll make sure I'll put all that in the
This,
show notes. People can
thank you.
find you.
Yeah, it's,
Yeah.
those are the quickest ways to find everything. Yeah.
Oh, great. Wonderful. Well, it's been such a pleasure to have you as a guest today. And I learned a ton, and I'm sure that our listeners did too. And they'll have lots of questions sparking and so that they can reach out to find more
Good.
information about you. Okay.
Good.
Thanks so much again.
Thank you. Thank you.